Hundreds of thousands of men have died, and the conflict has now spread all over the globe. And as the snows and winds of November grow harsher, and the Western Front freezes into total stalemate, all of the warring armies realize one great reality of this war. Defense is more powerful than offense. This would remain true until the bitter end. I'm Indy Neidell. Welcome to the Great War. Here's where we left off last week. The Ottoman Empire had just joined the war, and Russia had sent troops into eastern Turkey. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was once again trying to crush the Serbs, while simultaneously further north retreating from the Russians. The Russians had actually pushed back both the Austrians and the Germans, but their advance into Germany had stalled when supply lines grew too long. And on the Western Front, the Kaiser himself had come to Flanders to give his troops moral support as they hurled themselves again and again and again at the Allies at the Battle of Ypres, trying to break through to the sea. The Allies had kept the Germans from reaching the Channel or the North Sea for nearly 2 months now, and though virtually the entire line from the sea down to Switzerland had solidified into stalemate up in Flanders at the ongoing Battle of Ypres, the fighting was heavier than ever. The Prussian Guard was ordered to take Ypres on the 11th, and their attack was preceded by the heaviest artillery bombardment of the war, probably the heaviest of all time up until then. This bombardment had been made possible by a week of stockpiling artillery shells, and for a little while, the Germans actually broke through the British front lines, but were beaten back once again. This attack was so concentrated and so devastating that at one point, the British reportedly thought they saw a wave of Germans advancing in the smoke and fog. But as the smoke cleared, they saw that it wasn't a wave, it was an entire bank of dead German soldiers. The German breakthrough had failed once again. The fighting at Ypres faded to a stop mid-month as high winds, rain, and snow came on for days, and movement became nearly impossible in the abysmal weather. There were still sporadic attacks, and though the Germans dug in on the 17th, the end of the battle wasn't really apparent for another few days. Both sides set to work building trenches, and the lines stretched from the sea to the Alps, supported by growing amounts of artillery, and their bombardments were limited only by shortages of shells. The casualties were enormous in Flanders, hundreds of thousands of men, French, Belgian, German, British, and from all corners of the imperial world. The British had now lost their professional army, the best soldiers in Europe, and in future would rely on new recruits who could only hope to hold the line and wait for reinforcements, and all for what? Why Ypres? Well, look at it. The land to the north is flat and is linked to the coast by rivers and canals, but to the south rises about 500 meters, which gives an excellent height advantage to whoever controls the town. Also, all of the major roads in the area converged on Ypres. It was a great strategic position and would be fought over for the rest of the war. And the names, Langemarck, Polygon Wood, Armentières, and all the others from the First Battle of Ypres and the Race to the Sea are now the stuff of legend on both sides. But even though the Allies were outnumbered, out-equipped, and outgunned, they won because modern warfare turned out to have a heavy defensive advantage, which was unexpected. Everyone now saw that even heavy artillery barrages and huge offensives with superior numbers could be held back by infantry and cavalry armed with rifles and machine guns dug into trenches. Here's a little anecdote from Ypres that I read in Martin Gilbert's The First World War that I thought I'd throw in. At Dixmude, a German battalion of mostly students managed to overrun a French machine gun post during the fighting this week. One of those students attacking was 19-year-old Richard Sorge, who later turned against Germany and became one of Stalin's most trusted spies. It was he that warned Stalin of Hitler's plans to attack Russia in June 1941, and that Japan had no intentions to attack Siberia, which allowed Stalin to deploy his troops in the west to win the Battle of Moscow. Sorge was later caught and executed by the Japanese. Okay, defense was also playing a huge role in the east. After retreating from the Russians for over a week, an Austrian army, well over 100,000 strong, opted for an entirely defensive strategy and barricaded themselves into the fortress of Przemyśl, the Russians at the gates. This second siege of Przemyśl began November 9th and would be the longest siege of the war. But though the war had settled down to stalemate in the west and siege in the Carpathians, the center of the Eastern Front was still in flux. The Germans had discovered that Russia was gearing up to continue her temporarily paused invasion of Germany. so German General Ludendorff decided to make a preemptive strike. In a great feat of logistics, he managed to turn and relocate his whole army to strike against the Russian right flank. On November 11th, the Germans attacked, hitting the overextended Siberian Corps hard and opening up a 30-mile gap in the Russian lines, cutting off the Siberians. The Germans were actually outnumbered, but their attack was so well managed it took 3 or 4 days before the Russian command realized the danger as the Germans pressed forward. The Russians then disengaged and force-marched back to the city of Lodz, a railway center that was very well supplied. And here, they prepared to meet the advancing Germans. The Russians had a gigantic army, but the fronts they were fighting on became larger and more numerous, with a new one opening up as Russian troops invaded Turkey. Now that the Ottoman Empire had joined Germany and Austria-Hungary in the war, this was the first engagement of the Caucasus Campaign that would continue throughout the winter. This attack was named the Bergman Offensive after Russian General Georgy Bergman, and his troops had crossed into Turkey on November 2nd in 3 localized fronts. The Turkish counteroffensive this week was not only large, it also even threatened to surround the Russians. Russian reinforcements managed to prevent this from happening, but this was a real crusher for Russian morale, as their losses are estimated as high as 40%. This was also a big boost for Enver Pasha, the Turkish Minister of War, who'd brought the Ottomans into the war in the first place. Something else that was designed as a moral boost for the Turks also happened this week when Ottoman Sultan Mehmet V declared a jihad on the Allies November 11th. Germany and the Ottomans had hoped that all Islam would rise against the Allies with the declaration of a holy war, but nobody really bothered as it turned out, certainly not the Indian Muslims or the Russian Tatars. Thing is, if holy war meant taking one set of Christians as allies to fight other Christians as enemies, then it didn't really make sense to most people. The war had come to the Middle East though, with the Battle of Fao on November 8th. When the Ottomans had entered the war, the British had feared for their oil supplies on the Persian Gulf and decided to seize the Ottoman-controlled part of the coast around Fao Fortress. They had landed the 6th but failed to advance because of heavy fire from the fortress. And 2 days later, the British heavy artillery arrived and they were able to take both the fortress and the town. This was the first battle of the Mesopotamian campaign. And so the week ends, with the British marching into Mesopotamia, the Turks triumphant, the Russians falling back to Lodz, and the rain and snow temporarily quieting the guns in the west. And as for the Austrians, in the north they may be in their fortress, but in the Balkans, 500,000 of them were pushing deeper and deeper into Serbia. Here's a little foreshadowing, thanks again to Martin Gilbert. Vladimir Lenin, at this time exiled in Switzerland, wrote that we were now in the epoch of the bayonet, and from this would spread a civil war between classes, which was the prelude to a revolution and the triumph of the working classes. And indeed we were in a new epoch, but perhaps not just of the bayonet, but an epoch of defensive war. Whether it was the use of or destruction of railways, as the French and Belgians did early in the war, or the Germans did in Poland last week, or with rifles along the lines in Flanders, we see again and again that in this war, defense has the advantage in pretty much every way. Thousands upon thousands of men, backed by heavy artillery, would charge enemy trench positions, and thousands upon thousands of men would die, falling to the rifle or the machine gun in no man's land for, at best, an advantage of a few meters. This was modern war. Now, one could argue that this modern war was the end of all glory, a great brutal equalizer that didn't care who lived or who died. But even from the mud of the trenches, some remarkable historical figures emerged. We don't always have time to tell their story in our regular episodes, so we started a new biography format in which we tell their stories. You can check out our first episode about Manfred von Richthofen, aka the Red Baron, right here. And let us know in the comments what you think about it and who else you want to see featured. See you next week.